there is a truck that has outsold every car, every SUV, and every competitor in America for more than 4 decades. Not a single year off the top. And here is the part almost nobody talks about. The majority of people who own it today rarely, if ever, use it for the one purpose it was originally created to serve. This is the story of how a post-war work tool became the best-selling vehicle in the richest consumer market on Earth, and how America used it to build an identity rather than haul cargo. Before we go further, if you're watching this on your television, thank you for having us in your home. Stories like this one take serious work to put together, and every subscriber and every share helps this channel keep going. If you find yourself thinking someone else needs to hear this, share it. It matters more than you might think. In January of 1948, Ford Motor Company unveiled something new at its manufacturing facilities in Highland Park, Michigan, and Richmond, California. It wasn't glamorous. There were no celebrities, no flashy launch events. What Ford presented was a lineup of trucks, and the men who needed them already knew exactly what they were looking at. The country had just come through 4 years of war. Millions of Americans had returned from Europe and the Pacific. The factories that had been building bombers and military vehicles were beginning to shift back towards civilian production. And the economy, which had been suppressed for years, first by the Great Depression, then by wartime rationing, was beginning to move again. Farms needed tending. Subdivisions were being planned. Highways were being built. Contractors needed haulers. Ford's pre-war trucks had been adequate machines, but they carried a fundamental limitation. They had been designed on the same platforms as Ford's passenger cars. The frame underneath was essentially a car frame adapted for heavier use. By 1948, that approach no longer made sense. America's post-war demands were different, larger, more varied, more commercial. So Ford started over. What emerged on January 16, 1948 was the F-Series, a completely new truck lineup, purpose-engineered for hauling rather than adapted from anything else. The chassis was built from the ground up for truck use. The suspension was redesigned. The frame was stronger. The cab was wider than before, with better visibility, and Ford gave it a name that suggested something beyond mere utility: the $1 Million Cab. The new trucks were organized by payload rating, running from the half-ton F1 up through the F8 for heavy commercial use. The people who bought that first F1 were not dreamers. They were farmers in Kansas hauling grain to the elevator, construction crews in Ohio loading concrete forms, ranchers in Texas moving cattle feed across land that had no paved roads. These were buyers with problems to solve and a truck that solved them. The pitch from Ford wasn't about identity or aspiration. It was simpler than that. The truck would do the job, and it did. Ford's production numbers reflected genuine demand from working America. By the early 1950s, the F-Series had established itself as the foundation of Ford's commercial business. When the trucks were updated for the 1953 model year, the F1 becoming the F-100, the engineering improvements still followed the same principle: make it more capable, more durable, more reliable for the people who depended on it. But something else was beginning to happen. Something small, easy to miss in the sales ledgers of the early 1950s, but significant. The suburbs were expanding. Between 1950 and 1960, American suburban populations would grow at a pace without precedent in the country's history. Entire towns were being built in what had recently been farmland outside of Cleveland, outside of Los Angeles, outside of Chicago and Dallas and Atlanta. Highways were being constructed that connected these new communities to city centers. The interstate highway system, authorized by Congress in 1956, would eventually bind the country together with 41,000 miles of limited access road. What this meant practically was that American families were moving outward. They were buying houses with driveways and garages. They were acquiring lawns, backyards, boats, trailers, camping gear, landscaping equipment. And they began looking at pickup trucks not purely as industrial tools, but as vehicles that could carry all of it. Ford noticed. The company began quietly adding features that had nothing to do with work. Better interior materials, more comfortable seating, optional two-tone paint. The trucks were still marketed as workhorses. The imagery in Ford's advertisement still showed construction sites and grain fields. But the people actually walking into dealerships were beginning to include buyers who had never hauled anything heavier than a lawnmower. This created a tension inside Ford that the company would spend the next 3 decades carefully navigating. How do you build a truck tough enough for genuine work while making it comfortable enough for a growing audience that didn't actually need to do any? The answer, it turned out, was to do both, and to let buyers decide which version of the truck they were buying. In 1975, Ford introduced a new model designation that would eventually become the most important vehicle name in American automotive history. It was called the F-150. The reason for creating it was almost bureaucratic. Federal regulations at the time set different requirements for trucks based on their gross vehicle weight ratings. The F-100, which had been Ford's standard half-ton pickup, was bumping against those regulatory thresholds in a way that complicated its sales. The F-250 was more truck than many buyers needed. The F-150 was positioned between them, slightly heavier duty than the F-100, and technically outside the weight classification that triggered the most restrictive federal standards. It was, in the most literal sense, a regulatory workaround. Almost nobody outside Ford's product planning departments saw anything significant in the new model designation. Trade publications noted the F-150's existence and moved on. The truck looked essentially the same as the F-100. It worked essentially the same. The name was just a number. What happened next would take years to fully understand. The F-100 was discontinued at the end of the 1983 model year. By then, the F-150 had already absorbed its audience and begun building one of its own. And in 1976, just 1 year after the F-150's introduction, the F-Series as a whole became the best-selling truck in America. It has never surrendered that position since. The transformation that followed through the late 1970s was subtle, but decisive. Ford was watching its buyers closely, and what the data was beginning to show was that a growing percentage of F-Series customers were not farmers or construction workers. They were suburban Americans who worked in offices and warehouses and service businesses. They drove their trucks to work. They drove them to the grocery store. They took them camping on weekends. The truck bed, which Ford engineers had carefully engineered for payload, often carried nothing at all. This created an opportunity. In 1978, Ford introduced the Lariat trim level for the F-Series. The name had been borrowed from American ranching culture. A lariat is a lasso, but the product had almost nothing to do with ranch work. It had carpeted floors, upgraded upholstery, a more refined interior with trim details that belonged in a passenger car rather than a work vehicle. It sold. Then, in 1979, Ford's advertising team arrived at 3 words that would outlast every executive involved in creating them: Built Ford Tough. The slogan was coined by copywriter Robert Yost and the team at J. Walter Thompson's Detroit office. It debuted in television commercials that showed F-Series trucks being dropped from cranes, conquering mud fields, and hauling enormous industrial loads. The imagery was pure work truck mythology, machines being tested at the edges of their capability by men who needed them to hold. What the slogan actually accomplished was more complex. It didn't just describe a truck, it described a buyer. To own a truck that was built Ford Tough was to be, by extension, the kind of person who needed something that tough. The advertising wasn't selling capability to working tradesmen who already understood it. It was selling an image of capability to a suburban audience that found the idea of it appealing. It was one of the most effective pieces of automotive marketing in American history, and it worked precisely because it aimed at what people wanted to believe about themselves, not at what they were actually doing. By the early 1980s, America was going through its own turbulence. The oil shocks of the late 1970s had rattled consumer confidence. Japanese automakers had established serious beachheads in the American market, offering small, fuel-efficient cars that Detroit had been slow to develop. Ford's car division was struggling. The company posted losses. Entire product lines were under review. The F-Series didn't wobble. Through the 1979 oil shock and the recession of the early 1980s, full-size truck sales dipped. But the F-Series maintained its lead among American truck buyers. The buyers who needed trucks for work continued to need them. And the buyers who wanted trucks for identity continued to want them. Economic pressure pushed people towards smaller vehicles in the car market, but the pickup truck had become something different from a car. It occupied a separate emotional category. Ford's 7th generation F-Series, the model years running from 1980 through 1986, recognized this directly. The redesign brought a more aerodynamic front end, improved fuel efficiency, and continued expansion of the interior comfort features that had been creeping into the lineup for years. The XLT Lariat trim was reinstated and refined. The message was consistent. This truck will do anything you ask of it, and while it's doing it, you'll be comfortable. In 1981, Ford announced a number that confirmed what the company already suspected. The F-Series had become not just the best-selling truck in America, but the best-selling vehicle, beating passenger cars from its own lineup, beating Japanese imports, beating every category of four-wheeled transportation that Americans could choose from. It has held that position with only brief interruptions ever since. What Ford had discovered, not fully by design, but through years of attentive reading of its customers, was that the pickup truck had become the vehicle of American aspiration in a way that passenger cars no longer were. The car, by the 1980s, carried cultural baggage. Sedans were practical, efficient, sensible. Station wagons were associated with family obligation. Minivans, emerging in 1984, were marketed explicitly at the domestic life that many buyers were quietly trying not to think of themselves as living. The pickup truck offered something different. It suggested capability, freedom, self-reliance. It implied that its owner was ready for something demanding, even if the most demanding task in their actual week was parking in a suburban shopping center. By 1995, surveys of F-150 buyers were beginning to reveal something remarkable. More than half of owners reported they never used their truck bed for work purposes. They were driving the best-selling vehicle in America as a daily commuter, a statement, a way of organizing their identity in a country that had decided the truck meant something. Ford, to its credit, was honest about what was happening, at least internally. The company began investing in the comfort and technology features that its actual buyers were clearly prioritizing. Crew cabs gained ground. Extended cabs with rear seating became standard equipment in many configurations. Interior quality improved steadily. The 9th generation F-150, introduced for the 1997 model year, was arguably the first full redesign that treated ride quality and interior refinement as priorities equal to payload and towing. It was not a betrayal of the truck's original purpose. It was an honest reading of who was actually buying it. The King Ranch trim, introduced in 2001, made the evolution impossible to ignore. The name was a reference to the famous King Ranch in South Texas, one of the largest working ranches in the United States, covering territory roughly the size of Rhode Island. But the truck bearing that name had nothing to do with ranching. It offered leather interior surfaces stitched in a pattern that referenced the ranch's brand, running boards, and premium audio equipment. It was a luxury vehicle wearing the iconography of working America. It was also one of the most successful premium truck trims Ford had ever offered. The King Ranch didn't create a contradiction so much as it crystallized one that had been building for decades. The F-150 was now simultaneously two things: a genuine work truck capable of everything its buyers had needed in 1948, and a cultural object whose meaning had almost entirely detached from its mechanical function. Then came the aluminum. In 2015, Ford made the most controversial engineering decision in the F-150's history. The company announced that its next-generation truck would abandon the steel body construction that had defined pickup trucks for a century. The new F-150 would use a military-grade aluminum alloy body, the same general category of material used in aerospace and commercial aviation. The reaction from the automotive press and the truck buying community was somewhere between skepticism and outrage. Aluminum was associated with expensive sports cars and aircraft, not work trucks. Body shops across the country weren't equipped to repair it. Competitors ran advertisements mocking the change. Ram circulated promotional materials emphasizing their continued use of steel. Ford had calculated the risk carefully. The aluminum body shed approximately 700 pounds from the previous generation. That weight reduction translated directly into better fuel economy, higher payload ratings for the same engine output, and improved towing performance. The truck would be lighter and yet more capable on the numbers that actually mattered to buyers who used it for work. Ford spent 2 years and more than 300,000 miles testing the aluminum body through real-world fleet use in mining, utility, and construction industries before the truck went on sale. In 2013, a disguised pre-production F-150 was entered in the Baja 1000, one of the most demanding off-road races in North America, to evaluate the body's durability under extreme conditions. The skeptics were waiting for the truck to fail. It didn't. The 2015 F-150 became the first full-size Ford pickup to earn a 5-star overall safety rating from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Sales, rather than declining as some analysts had predicted, continued to climb. The aluminum body became an industry benchmark. The truck, built from material originally associated with fighter jets, was now hauling landscaping trailers in the suburbs of Phoenix and Denver. By 2016, the F-Series had been the best-selling truck in America for 40 consecutive years. It had been the best-selling vehicle overall for 35. Over 40 million had been sold since the first F1 left the Highland Park assembly line in 1948, and survey data, quietly compiled by research firms that study vehicle buyers each year, continued to reveal the gap between the F-150's mythology and its daily reality. According to research conducted by Strategic Vision, whose work surveys hundreds of thousands of new vehicle buyers annually, approximately 63% of F-150 owners rarely or never tow anything with their truck. Around 32% rarely or never use it for personal hauling. Nearly 90% reported they never use it as a work vehicle in any professional sense. The most common use of the best-selling vehicle in America? Commuting, shopping, driving for pleasure. What the research also revealed was why. Surveys asked F-150 owners what words they most strongly associated with their truck. 2 answers appeared more consistently than any others: rugged and powerful. Not useful, not capable, not economical. Buyers weren't choosing the F-150 because of what it could do. They were choosing it because of what owning it said about them. This is not a criticism. It is the actual story of what the F-150 became. And it is a more interesting story than the one Ford originally set out to tell. There is a principle in consumer psychology sometimes called identity signaling. People use products not just to fulfill practical functions, but to communicate something about who they are and who they want to be perceived as. A watch can tell time and cost $30. It can also cost $30,000 and communicate something entirely different about its owner's status and values. The function is identical. The meaning is not. The F-150 became America's most successful identity vehicle. Not because Ford planned it that way in 1948, but because the truck happened to carry exactly the right set of associations at exactly the right moment in American cultural history. Toughness, self-reliance, capability, the ability to handle anything. In a country where those values were central to the national self-image, a vehicle that appeared to embody them was inevitably going to attract buyers who wanted to embody them too. Ford's advertising team understood this long before the academics caught up to it. Built Ford Tough was not merely a description of the truck's engineering. It was a permission structure. It told buyers that by purchasing this vehicle, they were affiliating with something: a tradition of hard work, physical capability, American durability. The fact that many of those buyers would never test the truck's actual limits was almost beside the point. The association was enough. This is why the luxury truck market exists at all. A genuinely functional work truck doesn't need leather seats. It doesn't need a 12-speaker audio system, or a massaging driver's seat, or a touchscreen the size of a laptop. These features are not designed for the contractor who needs to haul 12,000 pounds of roofing material to a job site in San Antonio. They are designed for the executive in Denver who wants to feel connected to something rough-edged and authentic without actually experiencing any roughness. The King Ranch, the Platinum, the Limited. These are aspirational objects that happen to have a truck bed attached. And yet, the F-150 never abandoned its working buyers. This is the detail that complicates any simple reading of the truck's cultural transformation. Throughout the decades of comfort upgrades and lifestyle marketing, Ford maintained its engineering investment in payload ratings, towing capacity, suspension durability, and work-grade capability. The base XL trim remains a genuine work truck with a price that remains accessible to buyers who need it for actual labor. Municipalities and construction companies and utility providers continue to buy F-Series trucks in fleet quantities, precisely because the engineering holds up. The F-150 became two vehicles at once. That duality, managed carefully over decades, is the actual secret behind its 40-plus years of sales dominance. In 2022, Ford introduced the F-150 Lightning. The truck was electric. It had no engine. At least not in any conventional sense. It had no tailpipe. Under what would normally have been a hood sat a large storage compartment Ford called the frunk, a front trunk that could hold cargo or power tools running off the truck's battery. The Lightning produced 580 horsepower in its extended range configuration. It could accelerate faster than many sports cars, and its most discussed feature had nothing to do with driving. The F-150 Lightning could power a house. Ford built the truck with a bidirectional charging system that allowed it to export electricity to a home during a power outage. With a fully charged extended-range battery, the Lightning could power an average American home for several days. In a country where hurricanes, ice storms, and wildfires were increasingly disrupting electrical grids for extended periods, this was not a trivial capability. The truck that had originally been designed to haul grain across Kansas was now being marketed as backup infrastructure for the American suburb. The Lightning's starting price was initially announced below $40,000, which Ford positioned as a direct challenge to the assumption that electric vehicles were luxury goods for affluent early adopters. The strategy reflected something important about the F-150's cultural position. If you could make the Lightning feel like a truck rather than a technology product, the existing identity machinery that had been driving F-Series sales for 40 years would work in your favor. Whether the Lightning would inherit the F-150's cultural dominance remained an open question. Electric vehicle adoption moved more slowly in the truck segment than in the passenger car market, and the Lightning faced supply constraints in its early production years. But the fact that Ford chose the F-150 as the vehicle through which to introduce its most ambitious electric technology, rather than creating an entirely new nameplate, said something meaningful about what the company understood about its own product. The name carried weight. The truck had become bigger than its specifications. It had become a way Americans talked about themselves. There is a particular irony at the center of this story that the men who built the first F-1 in 1948 could not have anticipated. They were engineers solving a specific problem. Post-war American workers needed a better truck than the modified car chassis that Ford had been selling them for decades. The solution they built was honest and functional. It hauled grain and concrete and livestock. It got dirty. It broke down occasionally and got fixed and went back to work. The machine those engineers created would eventually be purchased, in its more recent and more expensive configurations, by buyers who wouldn't know where to find the nearest grain elevator and wouldn't care to learn. The King Ranch badge is hand-stitched onto leather seating surfaces inside trucks that have never been within 500 miles of the King Ranch. The aluminum body, developed partly because aluminum was lighter and could improve work truck efficiency, now covers trucks that commute on urban freeways with empty beds. What the men in Highland Park in 1948 were solving was a practical problem. What America decided to do with their solution was something else entirely. It turned a tool into a mirror, and for more than 4 decades, What Americans saw in that mirror was a version of themselves they wanted to believe in. Capable, tough, ready for anything, even when the most difficult thing on the day's schedule was parallel parking. Today, you cannot look at a new Ford F-150 without seeing both things at once: the work truck and the lifestyle object, the Highland Park assembly line and the King Ranch badge, the original buyers who needed it and the millions of buyers who simply want it. And the truck that was built to solve a problem became, perhaps accidentally, a way of answering a question that is much harder to resolve. Who does America want to be? A machine that began its life hauling grain across post-war Kansas is now hauling a very different kind of American ambition. The original problem it was built to solve has largely disappeared. The truck is still here. The F-150 isn't the only vehicle whose story diverged completely from the problem it was originally built to solve. A few years before Ford's engineers in Michigan began designing the first F-Series, a very different kind of machine was being built to answer a very different kind of emergency. One that would eventually lead to an off-road icon that had nothing to do with what its creators were trying to survive. That story is the Jeep, and it follows a path that the F-150 and every truck that came after it might not have taken without it.